I want to start out by sharing with you a little bit about the California Farm Demonstration Network. My goodness, it's funny how it's lagging there. Today's presentation is being sponsored by the California Farm Demonstration Network. You can see that this is a partnership with California growers and ranchers, as well as the 6 organizations that are across the top of your screen right here. The University of California Agriculture and Natural Resources Division, UC Davis, the Natural Resources Conservation Service of California, my organization, the California Association of Resource Conservation Districts, as well as the California Farm Bureau and the California Department of Food and Agriculture, who is generously supporting us in this presentation today. Today we will be hearing from Jessica Chiartas, a PhD candidate at UC Davis. And it looks like I've got a typo there on the name of the presentation, but it is, we're going to be learning about how to take a great soil sample. A little bit about the California Farm Demonstration Network. The objective of it is to showcase the implementation of conservation practices and systems, which can provide a pathway for adoption by both new and experienced farmers. Further, it will provide practical learning opportunities while at the same time fostering the formation of local connections. Today's presentation is one in a series of 4. Back in March, we heard from Dr. Eric Brennan, who led a presentation on what happens when you add compost and cover crops. We heard from Dr. Brent Holtz in April on whole orchard recycling. And next month, we'll be hearing from Jennifer Moore about soil microbial dynamics. Now, if you have not had a chance to register for all of these in the series yet, this QR code right here will take you to the page where you can find both the recordings for the previous meetings as well as the registration links for, I guess, just Jennifer's meeting from here on out. So that takes you to, for now, the CARCD website where these meeting recordings will be held, as we are in the process of developing a standalone website for the California Farm Demonstration Network. Stay tuned for that. These meetings will live there in the future. We will have continuing education units for certified crop advisors available at the end of the meeting. I'll be displaying a QR code that many of you use to take a quick snapshot and register your units. If that's not a functionality you use, then later in the meeting, you can put your name and CCA number in the chat, and I'll make sure to submit those. Okay, so I'm going to now stop sharing my screen. There we go. I would, at this time, I'm going to, let's see, I wonder if Karen Lowell has joined us yet. I'm looking for her across my screen here. That's okay. So let's see. In just a moment, I'm going to have Jessica introduce herself and tell us a little bit more. But in terms of the flow of this presentation, before we go much further, I just want you all to be entering your questions for Jessica as soon as they come to your mind. A couple of us in the background are going to be managing those chat questions and kind of grouping them for a better conversational flow after the presentation. So again, don't wait for the end of the presentation to put those questions in the chat box. Go ahead and put them in there as things come up for you. All right. We have reserved an hour and a half for the presentation, so we're going till 12:30. We're going to have, in general, about a short presentation followed by a long chat and kind of conversation with those of you who are attending here. And I will be facilitated shortly by a friend and colleague, Karen Lowell, who's an agronomist in the Salinas Valley. And she'll kind of jump on and share a screen after the presentation. So let's see. I think at this point, Jessica, I'm going to go ahead and have you start sharing your screen, and I will Just welcome you as a presenter here at the California Farm Demonstration Network meeting. Jessica's a PhD candidate in soils and biogeochemistry at UC Davis. She's done a lot of soil sampling across the state and has a lot of really interesting experience to share today. And so there we go. Jessica, I'm going to have you just take it from here as soon as you're ready. Just definitely start out by telling us a little bit about your experience and your expertise, and then roll into the presentation. Thank you so much for being here today.
Sorry about that. I was muted and I went into full screen and lost myself. Yeah, thank you for the very nice intro, Sarah. My name is Jessica Chiartas. I'm a PhD candidate at UC Davis in soils and biogeochemistry, and my research is focused on the long-term impacts of agriculture on soil carbon and soil health broadly. And as Sarah mentioned, I've been fortunate to take soil samples at a diversity of locations across the state and really get an appreciation for the diversity of soils that is California. And so, yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit today about how to collect a meaningful soil sample, and included in that is how to set up your sampling design, which means like how to select the locations that you're going to sample from, how to deal with issues like compositing, how to process your samples appropriately so that you don't contaminate or bias the results at all, which metrics maybe one might be interested in looking for. And that's going to vary depending on the questions that you're asking or the goals that you may have. And then touch a little bit about methods, but really just try to direct you to some resources where those can be found, because everything really is context specific, as we'll come to find when we're talking about soils. And I'll share a little bit on some efforts that are currently going on to really capture a way of standardizing this process better so that our data can be talking to each other more harmoniously. And so, yeah, I guess the goal here is for this to be a very fluid conversation, for folks to feel free to jump in with questions at any time. Of course, as Sarah mentioned, you can feel free to throw them in the chat as we go, and so that you don't miss them. But yeah, I think we'll have a couple surveys at different points as well to kind of gauge folks' interest. And Sarah, if this would be an appropriate time to do that, maybe we could just pop a quick survey of who's here and is that doable? Okay. Who's here and sort of what sort of interests you have in soil testing broadly, so we can make sure this conversation is super valuable to the folks on the line.
You got it. I think there we go. We got some quick responses already going on in the poll. I'll give you. Okay, voting slowing down, still at about 80%. Let's see. I don't always use polling. Jessica, can you see the results here on your screen?
I can't see the results.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and verbally report these out. Of those who test their own soils as a farmer or rancher, 12% of attendees. Those who help farmers and ranchers test their soils as CCAs, PCAs, or other technical assistance providers is 38% of the attendees. 28% are research scientists of some sort. 3% are teachers in an academic program training people to collect soils. And we don't have anybody from a soil testing laboratory in the attendee group. And the others is surprisingly high at 35%. So if you're an other, I'd be curious to hear a little bit more, like if you're an other, what does that mean? Okay, 84% voted. Thank you, everybody.
So yeah, it sounds like there's a nice diversity of folks on the line, and I think that that is part of the context of this conversation today, is that what we measure and how we sample is going to depend on our use of the information. Whether you're a grower that's trying to inform your management, or whether you're a research scientist that's trying to publish, or whether you're doing citizen science even. Those are all going to be different. Have different needs. And so, Sarah, was there a follow-up question that we had loaded on the types of things folks are interested in measuring? It'd be great to just kind of
Let's just roll through. You got it. Let's see. Relaunch polling. Oops, let's see. We're gonna go. I'm a little bit rusty on this. Here we go. Launching polling question number 2. What is the driver or purpose of your monitoring work? I believe you can select more than one of these as well, and will remain anonymous. And I will go ahead and share the results after this. So for those of you watching the recording, where folks are choosing between formal research, fine-tuning management on a working farm, documenting environmental impacts, or documenting soil properties for various purposes. About 70% of voters of attendees have responded. I'll give it a few more seconds.
And thanks to all for bearing with us for this
Yeah.
initial polling phase. Just kind of want to make sure we direct the conversation efficiently.
There's our results we didn't want to wait too long, but looks like a lot of folks are fine-tuning the management of a working farm or ranch, and another half are documenting soil properties for soil carbon or ecosystem markets or other purposes.
Great.
Okay. Jessica, you want me to move to the third poll right now, or should we hold that one for later?
We can hold that one for later.
All right.
So that's really great to hear. I mean, I think these are kind of the two most exciting areas around soil sampling right now, is just encouraging growers to engage more in the process of monitoring and evaluation so that they can inform their management and adaptively manage in real time. As well as there's this growing interest in ecosystem and carbon markets, and how do we verify or monitor impacts on the ground. I don't have the answers, but I'm curious about how we find the space in between, where all the efforts going into this monitoring work is also helping support and inform management. So I guess just to dive right in, pun intended, you'll see later. But yeah, there's a number of different ways that we can collect soil samples. We can use, sorry, I guess I'm not sure how to, there we go. We can use an auger. And I'll talk a little bit about the pros and cons of this in a moment. We can use a soil probe, which doesn't always allow us to go as deep, but allows us to take a lot of samples very quickly. And then my personal favorite is we can dig a pit. And so the challenges with an auger and a probe even is, and why I'm such a fan of soil pits, is that you can't really see the genetic horizons, the genetic layers of the soil. And so inevitably there's a mixing that occurs between horizons, and horizons are very distinct layers that have different properties to them. And so for mixing those, it kind of confuses what we're able to see in our results. And so, there's obviously the question of where to sample in general, but once you've chosen your sampling sites, there's the question of what depths to sample. And there's some agriculturally relevant depths with which to sample through, especially in tilled systems where you have distinct plow layers. But really, we oftentimes just choose standard sampling depths rather than being mindful of the actual genetic horizons in the soil profile. And so one of the things I like about a soil pit, whether you're using this to collect all of your samples or just as a ground truth, is that you can actually see those layers. It also, for a grower, oftentimes just gives a lot of insight into the ground that's beneath their feet, and can be a totally different way of looking at or framing their landscape. And so the challenges, of course, are that, you know, soils are very variable, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And so we want to be able to capture a broad range of locations across a field. And pits obviously aren't the most effective way of doing that. They're also quite destructive. You know, you've got to turn up a lot of soil to get into the pit. Backhoes can help, but again, that's just a little bit more intense on the field. But in the flip side, the advantages to an auger or probe, as I mentioned, are that you can collect a lot of samples in short order. And with the auger, you can still get to depth, which I'll also touch on as an important factor, without having to dig a bunch of pits all over. So commonly we'll dig a pit and then we'll do some augers alongside it to kind of increase the number of sites we have without having to dig too many pits. The other advantage of having a pit, and you can kind of see in this photo, there's a little ring sitting there just above my knee, is that it makes it a lot easier to collect bulk density samples, which might be relevant in certain contexts. And so the first thing, I mentioned this already, is that an important thing to remember is that soils are very diverse, and they're incredibly diverse in California, especially. We have a very large climatic gradient. You know, we have a variety of different paramaterials, the effects of the Coast Range versus the Sierra Nevadas. And so, you know, along with the broad diversity of landscapes and cropping systems, we also have a diversity of soils and climates. And so this is across the breadth of California, but it can also be incredibly diverse just on a given farm or ranch. And so figuring out how to sample within a given budget and deal with that diversity is a huge challenge in soil science. And so some work has been done recently out of Toby Eugene's lab on the Soil Web app to be able to allow you to at least start somewhere. You know, you can pull up your landscape and you can see what the general variation across your landscape is. And that can be a great starting point for determining where you want to collect your samples. Because if you're mixing sampling locations within soil types, again, you're going to confound your results a bit. And so that is a really great tool. There's been some work developed out of Yale to develop an app called Stratified, and it's still kind of in beta. But the idea here is to use, if you see on this map on the left, this was also from Scott Devine and Toby Eugene, using something called K-means cluster analysis to determine different soil health regions, basically, soil regions, sorry, for thinking about soil health and how different management practices might impact the landscape, and even which practices are ideal for a given landscape. And so this K-means cluster analysis allows us to basically use things that we already know about the landscape to determine how to, what's called stratify, actually the name of this other app, how to stratify the landscape effectively so that we can collect samples that are controlling for variability as much as possible. And so in addition to things like Soil Web and what we know about the variation of soil types across a landscape, you can add layers like NDVI, or the vegetation index. You can add NDWI, the wetness index, because things like a moisture gradient or the vegetation that you've had historically or currently on a landscape may also affect the results of your soil samples. And so as much as we can control for the different variabilities we know about and stratify our sampling into key regions, the more information, more meaningful information we can get out of our data. And so oftentimes what folks are looking at more is this idea of you do this stratification and then you randomize your sampling within it. It's called stratified random sampling. And so typically a lot of folks have used transects or grids, and that can be useful on a grower scale. But if you're trying to do research, or really understand the impacts of a new management practice, you want to remove as many of those confounding variables as you can. And so this is something that folks are looking at a lot more, this idea of stratified random sampling. It just increases the power. If you thinking in statistical terms, it increases the power of our sampling efforts, and it reduces some of the noise in our results, which if you've meddled with soil samples, you know that that variability can be quite high. And the other thing to note is that soils are three-dimensional bodies. And so this is just kind of a graphic of some of the mechanisms that can move organic material throughout the soil profile, that can just kind of mix up our horizons a bit. You see everything from bioturbation, which is just animals mixing things around, to things like tillage that are a physical perturbation. Even something we have commonly in California, these shrink swell clays that that basically allow these cracks to open up and things can fall into those cracks, translocating things deeper into the soil profile. And so just to kind of ground that in something, this is focusing on soil organic matter, soil carbon, but just to ground that in some research we did at the long-term research station here in Davis, Russell Ranch, we found that if you kind of just hover the bottom of the screen here or you just look at the soil profiles on the left that only go to 30 centimeters, what we found is that in a conventionally managed corn tomato system, we lost about 3.8 megagrams per hectare of carbon. In a conventional system with a winter cover crop, we increased about 1.4 megagrams per hectare. And in a organically managed system with compost and cover crop, it increased 7.9 megagrams per hectare. The issue is that if you look down to 2 meters, so the profile on the right, the results didn't change too much in the conventional system, but in the conventional plus winter cover crop system, we actually had a whole system loss that was basically the losses at depth offset the gains in the surface. Similarly, in the organically managed system with compost and cover crop, we actually largely underestimated our gains. So 2/3 of the increase actually occurred below 30 centimeters. And so this is kind of just a real world example focused on carbon here, but of how, if you think about organic matter, there's a lot of other nutrients that go with it. It has effects on pH, all these things. And so this is kind of a good proxy of looking at the potential implications of a lack of depth, so to speak, in our soil sampling. All this said, once again, just like with the pits in general, going to depth increases the labor, the time, the cost, increases your sample size. So all of your analytical costs are going to be multiplied as well. This may still be in the purview of research, looking at depth, but it is an important thing to think about in terms of the sustainability of our systems, even things like nitrate and being able to see what's happening below 30 centimeter depth. So in terms of sampling design, I mentioned a little bit about k-means cluster analysis, and from a more rigorous research perspective, these are sampling protocols. One's from Russell Ranch. You can find it on the ASI website. The one on the right is from FiberShed. It's a citizen science protocol. And these are just showing basic ways that you can set up a transect or a grid to collect soil samples. The idea, as I mentioned, soils are variable. You'll hear me say that a lot probably. And so it's important to constrain the variability as much as possible by doing this stratification that we mentioned. But it's also important to collect a large amount of samples from across that strata, so to speak. Some folks argue for compositing those samples. So like if you look at the picture on the left, you would take a sample at each of these points at the end of the arrow, at both ends of the arrow, basically. And a lot of folks argue for compositing those samples because it'll lower your cost and it'll give you a much better picture of the whole field. That might mute or or hide some of the field scale variability you might have with nutrient cycling, or areas where water is ponding, or areas where it's draining too quickly. And so there may be, you know, depending on the budget and the constraints that you might have, there may be an interest in not compositing at some time points, or if you're trying to look at change over time, especially at a baseline collection. You know, and if you don't have budget to analyze all that right away, you can always archive your composites, and we'll talk about how to process samples so that you can archive them safely and securely. But, you know, compositing is good because it allows you to sample a lot more fields within a given budget, but it also does hide some of the information that you could be collecting. And so just trying to find that balance within your budget and how frequently you're sampling. But compositing can be a useful tool. I mentioned stratification previously, and doing strata based on, you know, soil type and NDVI and other kind of natural sources of variation. But something else that's really important to consider that I didn't mention was historic management or current management, or even future management goals. And so also wrapping that into the way that you segment fields is really important. And so, yeah, I guess moving on from that, there's a lot of resources around how to select your design, and then the number of samples you can collect. More is always better. It will give you more information, but obviously there's constraints to a certain extent. I guess I should also touch on when you're collecting your sample. It's really important that you remove any sort of live vegetation or litter that might be there. If you apply compost, you don't want to be sampling right into compost. That also references the timing of your sampling, and so you want to make sure that you're being consistent with your timing of sampling. You know, typically, especially for a grower, looking at things at the beginning of the season and sometimes even the end of season can be valuable information. But what's really important is that you're consistent year on year about when you sample, because you know, soils are dynamic and microbes are active and things are changing across the course of a day, across the course of a season, across the course of a year. And so we just want to be fairly consistent with our timing of sampling. And we also want to be mindful that we're not sampling right after a heavy rain, for instance, or right after we've applied compost. Just kind of try, and then again, trying to be consistent year to year. If you know that there was moisture later in the season one year, and then there's rain coming earlier this season, you might want to push up a little bit so that you're sampling in dry conditions both times. So timing, but also thinking about how climate interacts with the timing. And again, just making sure that you're not getting any additional organic materials into your sample that don't belong. This is another issue that comes up with augering as well, because once you pull the auger out, inevitably things fall down into the hole. And so whether you can reach in and pull out things, or if you just dust off the top of the auger to make sure that you're not contaminating your sample, these are all important considerations. And so the next thing is just processing your samples. And we want to try to process our samples as quickly as possible. If you can't process them right away, there's ways to store them in the meantime. But while you're in the field, especially if it's in the heat of California, spring or summer, you definitely want to have a cooler on site and keep your samples cool while you're collecting them. And if you're doing anything around microbial sampling, you're going to want to make sure that you have not just a cool cooler, but a really ice cold cooler. And you're going to want to be kind of mashing your samples in between ice so that it's got ice on the top and ice on the bottom. But as soon as you can get those samples into a refrigerator or a freezer, depending on your analysis, the better. Even better if you can process your non-microbial samples right away. That would be ideal. And so that basically looks like taking them back somewhere, breaking them up, laying them out in a very thin layer to air dry. Oftentimes, the reason there's a star next to sieve to less than 2 millimeters is twofold. There are some analyses that folks are looking at maybe only sieving to less than 4 millimeters. And so that's, you know, something to consider in terms of how much you're breaking up the aggregates. But another reason why this is relevant is if you let things dry too much on a really clayey soil, you might have a hard time sieving them later. And so but at the same time, if they're moist when you collect them, it may be challenging to sieve them through. So there may be a balance of letting them air dry a little bit before you can sieve them, but also being mindful not to let them dry up too much if they're clayey, because you won't be able to get them through a sieve. Once they've air dried, depending on the analyses that you're going to conduct, things like soil carbon, total nitrogen, there's a suite of total elements like phosphorus, zinc, nickel, iron, that you want to actually oven dry and grind your samples into a fine powder. And so yeah, there's a lot of different ways that folks do that. The common way that we use in research is with a ball mill that kind of just turns, and it has steel balls in the center and it grinds it up into a powder. You can also use a mortar and pestle. And a lot of labs will actually do this process for you. And so finding a lab that is able to process the samples for you and for the given analysis that you have to do. But it is very important just to be mindful of not leaving your soils sitting in a hot car, for instance, because it's going to affect the results that you get on your analyses. So once you've collected your samples, the next step is determining what indicators you want to measure. And there's a lot of factors that go into selecting an indicator. As I mentioned, the ease of sampling, the ease of measurement, the accuracy of the measurement, the reliability of the measurement, the cost of the measurement, how sensitive it is to management, and especially for the growers on the call, the interpretability of the indicator for management. And so in addition to that, audience matters, right? And so if you're a grower and you're trying to inform your own management, you might be looking at different tests than a researcher who's trying to discover new things about soils and the impact of management, versus policymakers. For instance, the Soil Health Initiative, you may have noted, in California, required very superficial samples. It was, you just collected a wedge from the surface and sent that in. They used a transect method, as I mentioned before. Versus also industry is now getting interested in this space. And as we mentioned, carbon and ecosystem markets are wanting to verify impacts of management on ecosystem services broadly. And so each of these has different needs. And I think importantly for research and industry, there's a larger level of rigor and statistical power that you need, that we're starting to find requires a lot more samples than we may have historically thought. And so, across a given farm with thousands of acreage, it could get very high. I mean, we've even looked at several acres, 4 or 5 acre farms. You might need 100 samples to have a very rigorous analysis. And so that might be very different from what a grower needs. A grower might have key areas that they know either they have a fertility issue or a water dynamic issue, things are ponding or things are draining too quickly, and may be able to focus on really key areas to collect samples to answer questions that are relevant to them. These are some common metrics that are being looked at. Typical traditional soil tests focus on chemical properties like nutrient concentrations, pH, cation exchange capacity. Sometimes they'll include things like EC or SAR to get at salinity issues. But the emerging framework around soil health is kind of trying to take chemical, biological, and physical properties and combine them into one overarching analysis of a landscape. And so some of the physical metrics that folks are looking at are aggregate stability, infiltration rate, water holding capacity, and bulk density. And some of the key chemical metrics folks are interested in are soil organic matter, again, the nutrient concentrations for fertility, pH, salinity, also very important in California, and then biological metrics like microbial biomass and diversity, earthworms or invertebrate populations, and things like respiration, or how active is your microbial population. Importantly, I talked a lot about the challenges of variability and the need for taking lots of cores and collecting lots of samples. And I just want to stress with the biological tests, this becomes even more challenging. I mentioned that, you know, things are changing across seasons, and you have to be mindful of making sure that you're sampling at the same time of year. But also with biological things, microbial communities can be shifting throughout the day. They're changing after a rain event, so an irrigation event. And so it's really something that you need to be sampling a lot more frequently across a season. And really, because of the variability of soils, you need a lot of spatial coverage as well. And when you consider the cost of a lot of these analyses, and then you multiply it by the number of samples you need and the number of time points that you need them, it becomes challenging to make sense out of that data. And it's something that we're still figuring out in the research community as well. It's not to say that folks shouldn't do that if they're interested in kind of learning a little bit more about that part of their farm or ranch, but it is a challenging thing to make sense of without adequate data. And so just something to be mindful of, considering the cost benefit analysis. And so just to kind of go a little bit more onto the types of metrics that exist out there, there's some really great resources. The Soil Health Technical Note out of NRCS number SHXX, which recommends a lot of soil health indicators and methods or laboratory procedures for analyzing them. And I'll just kind of just show you an example from this document that it'll go through different processes that one might be interested in, and it'll provide indicators that you could use to assess those processes, as well as methods for doing that analysis and potential notes that might be pertinent. And so it goes through this for a variety of different ecosystem services provided by soils, and that can be accessed on the NRCS website. The Soil Health Institute also is doing some work on various indicators and has laid out indicators alongside methods and providing references as well for those methods. And so those are two resources that you can access online that maybe if you have an indicator of interest to you, you can find the appropriate method for analyzing that. And then the last thing I'll touch on is that, you know, we put a lot of stock in quantitative lab-based metrics, and there's a good reason for that. I think one of the biggest things is, you know, thinking about nutrient management and how to design your fertility plan. If you're not taking soil tests and you don't know what you have already, it's hard to kind of gauge what you should be adding. And so there is a very strong value to these lab-based tests. If folks want to be able to have soil carbon markets and be able to provide financial incentives for storing carbon, you know, sure, it's important that we have quantitative metrics that we can measure those things for. But these things can go hand in hand in tandem with qualitative assessments and more in-field assessments that don't carry as much cost, and also just might be a good practice for growers and technical assistance providers to be in to really understand what's happening on the landscape. And so NRCS, once again, has a great in-field soil health assessment that can walk you through some of these things. And just, you know, they may be things that a grower's already doing, you know, just when they walk the land, and they're things that they're already being mindful of. But this might be a helpful framework for just being able to start documenting these things, being able to go back and reference, oh, wait, what was it like last year? Or, you know, I remember this other thing that happened, and having kind of some documentation of that. Sorry, so that's the end of my talking at you. We want to really honor this model of keeping it conversational. And so I guess with that, we'd like to really open it up to questions. And I know that folks have been tracking the questions in the chat. And so, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I'm looking forward to this conversation that picks up here. Let's see, Karen Lowell, maybe if you have capacity to turn on your, there you are. Karen Lowell is an agronomist with the NRCS and is a certified crop advisor in the Salinas Valley. Karen is way deep into these things, and I want to, Karen, invite you now to facilitate this question and answer session. Thank you. Still muted.
You can hear me now, yeah?
There you go, all good.
Sorry, I'm using my phone because my computer connection often makes me sound all chopped up, so you have to unmute two places. So Jessica, thank you for that, and we do have questions, and I'm thinking there's one that's just a real specific one, and I wonder if we can maybe just offer your thoughts on that. Somebody was very interested in what caused the highest loss on that second profile you characterized at Russell Ranch. Your thoughts about why the cover crop system alone went down in overall.
That's a great question and a challenging one. There's been some follow-up research looking more deeply into it. There's two kind of theories, I guess, that are running on this. One is, and actually there's some research out of a lab out of Australia. The guy's name is John Kirkby, that's looked at stoichiometry, which is the ratio of nutrients. And so basically the idea is that microbes have a certain stoichiometry of carbon to nitrogen to phosphorus to sulfur that they need to build their bodies. And so the idea would be that if one of those nutrients is lacking, they either are unable to store that carbon or they have to go do work to find it, which means moving around or producing enzymes or what have you, or going into old or native soil organic matter to access those nutrients. And so in that process, there can be a mineralization of organic matter that happens, and also the carbon use efficiency, so to speak, may go down, that the microbes are doing more work to collect carbon than they're able to store. And so they're respiring more CO2 relative to what they're storing as quote unquote fat. And so that's one potential thing, that maybe the compost provided some additional nutrient that was limiting in the system. Again, the importance of frequent soil sampling and looking at the nutrient profile. The other potential thing that is happening is that, well, for one, in the organic system, we're adding a large amount of carbon through the compost, right? So it may be less that the loss is happening in the cover crop alone system, and it may just be that we're putting enough carbon back in the organic system to kind of override, this hot, dry climate of California where it's really hard to store carbon. The other thing that's worth noting, although it's not the most fun thing to hear, is, as I mentioned, like there's just a lot of variability in soils, and especially when you're looking at depth, especially when you're talking about an alluvial setting like we have out here in the valley. And we even have things like buried A horizons, which is like you had a really rich organic surface that got buried in a flood with materials. And so, there's a lot of field scale variability as it is, and we need a lot more samples than we typically have taken. And so it may just be a case of field scale heterogeneity and just got some cores that were really low in carbon in the 2012 sampling versus the 93 sampling. But yeah, those are kind of the general working hypotheses. that we're not really sure. We don't have the answers.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Thank you. And hopefully that answered Nellie's question. Kabir had a thought, and this is something that I know is tricky, right? If you're thinking about different kinds of management systems, his question was, when his comment was, tillage practices have a large impact on soil carbon distribution in soil. And this is a little bit related to what we just talked about. At Russell Ranch, there's a lot of tillage done that might affect how the carbon sequestered, but also where it is in the profile. And he was thinking about the possibilities of looking at 5 Points Research Station, where Jeff Mitchell's done his work, to think about how tillage might impact sequestration, but also where you find it in the profile. Do you want to comment on that?
Sure. Yeah, tillage definitely impacts distribution of carbon. The typical research looking at 0 to 15 centimeters. Initially, there was a lot of thought that there was a lot of soil carbon being built in the surface from no-till systems. But when they looked deeper, and there's a paper from a guy by the name of Baker. I think it's something like carbon sequestration. What do we really know, or something like that? But it was in 2007, and they basically looked at the 30 centimeter depth, and they found that really it was more just that it was homogenized, or there was a distribution of carbon happening from the tillage. And so, but that said, there's also the flip side of people feel that because in no-till systems, because you have these deeper roots happening and you can build up that soil structure, which again, this is something that we thought a little bit maybe at Russell Ranch, that having the cover crops in the system, we're creating pores that water can move deeper down the profile, and taking, dissolved organic matter, for instance, with it. And so there is some thought that maybe no-till systems could be storing carbon deeper at depth by allowing roots to really establish deep into the profile. We just don't really know what's happening at a broader depth yet. I will say that the 5 points, and I shouldn't speak for Jeff Mitchell, but I think he would also say that they've had trouble seeing much differences at depth at 5 points. They have seen an increase in carbon from cover cropping and from the combination of cover crop and no-till. But yeah, I think they again, the variability at depth is a huge challenge. I mentioned variability broadly, but it actually increases with depth. And because the concentrations of things like organic matter go down with depth, it actually just means you need even more samples. So.
Just what we want to hear. Good, thank you. So I want to skip to, there were a few questions that I characterized as specific sample handling or processing questions, and I want to make sure we answer those since that's a main theme for us. So one of them, and I'm going to tag on to it. So the question was, when processing samples, how important is it to remove all root fragments? And I'm going to add to that and ask you to address a couple other things. One, how feasible is it to know how well you've removed not only all your root fragments, but if you have amended the soil with compost or another carbon-based amendment, how feasible is it to know if you've removed that so you're not measuring what you just added, so to speak?
Those are great questions, and some of it may be philosophical, so bear with me. I think that in theory, if you're doing soil carbon, it's argued that you should be very mindful to remove all root fragments. I think in general, it's important, but to Karen's point, it's hard to benchmark or standardize that process and to really know how much did you remove all of them. And if you're comparing your results to someone else's results in any sort of way, that can get challenging. If you're doing something for yourself on farm and you're calibrated against yourself, it might be less of an issue because you can kind of control for that because you're the one doing it each time. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it's something that is, I say it's a little bit philosophical because it depends on what you think is part of the soil. So for instance, like if you're adding compost and you want to know how your soil is going to behave across the season, that compost is part of the nutrient turnover and all of that in your soil. And so it has some relevance. I think the challenge for soil carbon testing is very real though, because how do we know if someone's just applied compost and then they collect their sample and they send that off to a lab and we just measure total soil organic matter? How do we know that that's like stable organic matter and not, or sorry, we would actually measure total soil carbon. And so it's hard to know whether that's stable organic matter or whether that's something you've just added or if it's a root fragment or if it's this or that. There are ways at a research scale that we can fractionate and tell that more clearly. But that's, again, it becomes very costly and not very pragmatic. So I would say it's important to remove the really coarse roots and it's important to calibrate. Again, it's important to remove as much as you can, but if all you can do is remove the coarse fragments, that would be great. And then if you can calibrate to yourself, I think that's really important. And Karen, if you have other thoughts or if anyone else has other thoughts on that, feel free to jump in.
No, I think that's good. And one of the areas where it's particularly challenging for any of our participants who are working in range scenarios, it's
Yes.
If it's a surface applied compost and what you're trying to estimate is the change in soil carbon, then removing that surface applied material, it may or may not be relevant, but it's a research question that you certainly want to pay attention to, I guess, is the best way to think about it.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons we say not to sample, you know, right after a compost application. And if you have, make sure you clear the surface very well before you collect your sample. And you might think, oh, I've cleared it well, but if you, once you start making a hole, things find their way to fall in. So,
yeah. Yeah. For sure. There's, I think you're getting at the point that right answers are hard to come by, and it's a process of making your decisions might be a process of making your decisions and documenting your rationale for making them the way you have, and just being consistent if you're trying to compare across time or season. Okay. So that's good. Another question that was a straightforward question for you. This one's easier, Jessica, I think. If sending samples to a lab for processing and testing for soil organic carbon, is it still beneficial to air dry the sample before sending, or should you just send it in a Ziploc and keep cool when possible before sending? So what are your thoughts on that?
My bias would be to air dry before sending. I think if you are sure you can keep it cool in transit, that's possible. You know, that it's not going to completely destroy everything, but it's just challenging to make sure that it's kept cool. And in reality, even if you do keep it cool, there could still be some activity happening. And so I would say, just because of the cost of not just the analysis, but the time that you put into collecting the sample, if you have a place that you can air dry them before you send, that would be preferable.
It's also worth knowing how the lab that you're going to use intends to receive the sample. So it's good to check what their methodology calls for. Which leads to, there were a few questions, and I think maybe we'll follow up with some resources. There were a few questions about where people could find specific tests. So somebody wanted to know, is there a lab in Northern California that's capable of testing for soil organic carbon? You know, in general, is there a good place for people to look when they're interested in a particular test where they might find information about who's capable or offering that in a commercial lab?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there, you know, Google is always a good resource to find what's available. But there's also a broad range of labs and qualities. Definitely wanting to make sure that they're using QA/QC, and Karen, I'm drawing a blank on the acronym right now, but there's a proficiency testing standard that you'll want to make sure that the lab is engaged in. And that basically means that they're sending samples, they're part of a broader calibration that's happening across labs. And so you can assure that their instruments are a little bit more well calibrated. But in general, I'd say like to ask folks in your region if they have a lab that they trust. And there's always things like the UC Davis Analytical Lab. And I believe Chico State is ramping up their soil lab. You know, I have a small bias, obviously, towards university labs because I think there's a little bit more attention to QA, QC. Oftentimes, commercial labs are happening at rapid scale, and that's just the nature of what they do. But at the same time, they are able to get your samples turned around oftentimes much more quickly. And sometimes when you're you're taking a sample so that you can figure out your fertility management plan, you need answers more quickly. And so, yeah, there's a lot out there. And I think just in light of not wanting to endorse anything specifically, I would just say to ask around and check online and just look for that proficiency standard.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, there is a list of all, or a lot of the labs in California that I think was put together by the Sonoma Extension Group, and I can make that available. Generally, if you call a lab, you can ask them what tests they have, and many of them have information on their website that'll give you that information. With regard to the standards, I just want to share an interesting conversation I had with one of the private labs. They stopped running the standard samples that allowed them to retain a particular certification status because they didn't know anybody cared about it. And when they learned that that would make them eligible to be used for particular uses, they said, oh, we'll just throw them back in our batches. So I just want to say it's important to know you have a lab that is following appropriate protocols and so on, but don't assume that if they aren't, that they're a poor quality lab. Just throw that out there. So I can make that list of labs that the Sonoma group has put together available, and yeah, you can call and just ask a lab. I think, Jessica, it's true that most labs will do a measure of soil organic carbon, yes?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And that is something, though, to be mindful of is, there's different methodologies for soil organic matter. There's loss on ignition, which is really just looking at how much, you take a sample and you weigh it, and then you heat it at 1,000 degrees, and then you weigh it again. And essentially at that high of a temperature, anything organic volatilizes, right? And so the difference in mass is the mass of the organic matter. But the thing is that there's also things like mineral water that can be lost, and it just, there's a lot of room for error. And so it's not the most accurate metric, is one of the arguments some folks have. The flip side to that is if you're trying to look at change over time on your own site, then the mineral water loss should be fairly controlled for. And the other thing that's great about the loss on ignition metric is oftentimes it's included in a general soil test that gives you all your nutrients and your pH and CEC and things like that. And so that can be a valuable way for a grower, for instance, to be tracking their organic matter. But when we're talking about carbon markets and ecosystem markets, people really, because of the connection to climate and carbon, they really want to know how much carbon is in the sample. And so that's a different method that's called dry combustion. And that basically, it heats the sample as well, but it actually runs it through a chromatograph that tells you how much actual CO2 is evolved from the loss of organic matter. And so it's a more direct way of measuring carbon. And then I guess I also wanted to say something to the point that Karen made about the lab not knowing anyone cared. There's a lot of soil health tests folks are interested in doing now that aren't available at a lot of commercial labs. I think like Oregon State is doing some of those, Ohio State is doing some of them, Cornell's doing some of them, but it can be challenging to find labs doing those tests. But I think if enough people call and they see a commercially viable reason to run those tests, you know, they're likely equipped to do it. It's just a matter of knowing that there's interest out there. And Tony just threw a really great resource in the chat of UC Cooperative Extension list of labs. And so that might be also of use to folks. Oh, and I guess Kara also put one for CDFA's list of recommended.
Yeah, the list that Tony just threw in there is the one that I was referencing. Just most people, wherever they're working, they know who their typical lab is, and so they're likely to just call them. So very good. I wanted to, somebody asked a direct question. Before we go any further, I just wanted to answer it. The question was, when you refer to compost, are you referring to green waste compost, mushroom compost, or some other kind of manure-based compost? So I think it's probably, it differs depending on what scenario you're talking about. But do you want to talk anything about I don't know if that was in reference to the compost in the Russell Ranch scenario.
I guess I'll just say at Russell Ranch, it was composted poultry manure. But I think in general, what we've mentioned in terms of collecting samples, it could be it's any compost, you know, just whatever form you're adding carbon and nutrients in a very concentrated form that, you know, it could confound your results. And so just trying to avoid any compost, and even like we said, live vegetation, and even when you take it back to process, a lot of people will remove the roots as well. So
very good, very good. So I think it can be anything. It depends on where you are. There was a question, do you want to talk a little bit about the protocol, the sampling protocol that somebody asked you about, and then you threw in the link, the ASI sampling protocol?
Oh, yeah, I mean, that basically, I'm just pulling it up here on my end. So Russell Ranch put together a resource that basically walks you through how to collect the sample. And talks about some of the same things we talked about, just dividing up your landscape based on soil type, topography. They mentioned soil moisture gradients, but again, also considering historic management, current management, and then figuring out the depths you want to sample for, and then using this, they use an M-shaped transect pattern. And then collect samples across each of those. And so they're combining 10 samples on a given acre into one composited sample that then you would, for each depth, right? So you're not compositing different depths, but you're at a 0 to 15 depth, for instance, you're compositing all 10 locations for analysis. And so it also has a worksheet component, I believe, on that at that link, if you go to it, that walks you through how to calculate your soil organic matter, and also a protocol for how to measure bulk density, which we didn't dig into very much yet. So maybe that's a chance to kind of talk about bulk density, because bulk density, if you're trying to measure things like soil organic matter or total nitrogen or things like that, you know, if you want to talk about concentrations, can be important for thinking about the function of the soil and how it's going to perform. But if you're talking about, again, carbon markets or ecosystem markets, you really, a lot of the interest is on stocks. And so in order to get from a concentration or a percent of something in a given sample to the stocks, you have to know the density of the space that you're sampling, so the mass per unit volume. And one of the main ways that we do that is with a core. An aluminum core that you just pound into the ground, and then you extract and you kind of use a knife to level it off. And then you take that sample and you put it into a bag and you take it back to the lab and you dry it out, and you basically weigh it until it's completely lost, until the weight doesn't change anymore, basically. And so the idea is to dry it at about something like 200 degrees for Fahrenheit for 48 hours. But then you just, if you check it and you record the weight and then you put it back in and you come back and the weight has changed, then you want to go again. But once it's stopped changing, that's kind of the weight or the mass of just the soil without any of the water content. If you have rock fragments in your sample, it adds an extra layer. Those rocks need to be weighed separately, and then the volume of them needs to be determined. And I forget the name of the guy in the bathtub, but the displacement of water can give you the volume. And so you can take those rock fragments and put them in water and get an idea for the volume. And then you just want to adjust for that. And so this worksheet that they provide actually walks you through that whole process of determining the volume of your core and measuring your soil carbon stocks, measuring your bulk density, and then your carbon concentrations, your bulk density, and using that to determine stocks. So it's just a very simple protocol for sampling on that site. But there's, as I mentioned, there's an app called Stratified that can help add layers like soil type and NDVI and determine those sort of regions of sampling for you. And then you could either throw a transect on top of that, or you could randomize, there's even online, you can look up GPS randomizers and it'll give you a random group of sites within that region that you've set boundaries around. I don't know if that answers the question around the Russell Ranch resource, but that's what's in there.
So interesting tag on, since we're talking about bulk density. This is the question: in the context of more samples being better, but coupled with limited time and resources to collect or analyze those samples, do you have any thoughts on using the equivalent soil mass method to collect bulk density for deeper samples? Greater than 30 centimeters was the question, collected by Auger directly below samples collected using a quantitative core of different depths.
Yeah, I do have some thoughts on this. And it's, again, like one of those things where it gets complicated, and we want to be mindful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, because there's been a lot of great research that's been done that has value to it. But it is true that that ostensibly, if your management is changing soil organic matter, it's changing. It may also be changing the structure of your soil, the density of your soil. And so if you have these arbitrary set depths that you're measuring for, you might be comparing apples to oranges in some ways. And so if you can use this equivalent soil mass method, which basically, for those who are unfamiliar with it, you're collecting your samples and you're weighing them in real time and you also, take, you eventually take some of that soil and you dry it to kind of figure out the moisture content and be able to adjust for that. But you basically are able to then, instead of just comparing based on random depths, you're comparing based on similar masses. So hence the name, equivalent soil masses. And then you don't actually need to collect bulk density samples. And so one of the reasons I am a proponent for pits is that it also allows you to collect a bulk density sample out of the pit. But this method could provide a workaround where not only do you not need the pit to get the bulk density, but it might even be a more accurate way of getting at the change in soil organic matter. The fun little catch, there's a paper, and I forget who wrote it, that just came out. It's something like Soil's Dirty Little Secret. But there's another layer that some folks are saying you actually have to remove the organic matter as well from the soil to be able to compare on a mineral mass basis, rather than just a mass basis at large, which would complicate the ESM method even more. But I am sure that that's like the most rigorous way. But again, I think there's this balance of like rigor and practicality and cost and budget. And so trying to find what works in the middle, that may be one of those things, again, that's still in the research world, and folks don't need to worry too much about that right now.
It may be something to think about, though, if you have a soil that has been heavily amended with, say, a coarse chip green waste, right? Because then, if you don't remove that. So, Yeah, and that was from somebody who I know is working in some systems receiving some compost. So I'm looking at them on the screen, but you guys can't tell that. So there was a reminder, Sarah just reminded us that we have a poll that would, and I wonder if this might be good to do right now. We have a poll that asks what people are most interested in measuring or monitoring in their soils, and that might help guide us as we tackle the rest of the questions. So yes. Sarah, you wanna, there she goes.
Thank you, Sarah. I meant to ask that partway through the presentations.
I'll just add as well, if you are selecting other, I'd love to hear what that other is in the chat.
So as I'm watching them come in, I think bulk density is one of the standard measures to think about the physical properties of your soil. Maybe you could talk briefly about an infiltration test, Jessica.
Yeah.
That's of interest. General soil health, and we do have some questions that I'll prompt you with. Let's let folks keep coming in.
Sure.
So water holding capacity and dynamics, carbon of interest for a lot of reasons, nutrient availability for a crop. So let me read you these questions while people are filling it in. So somebody wanted to know if you are looking at active carbon, soil protein as indicators. So maybe you could comment on what value you think they might have for folks to track, and also what information we have about how that how results from a test like that are of practical value. Like, do we have calibration for our crops in our region?
Sure.
There was also some question about very early on, somebody working with biochar wanted to think about recalcitrant glycoproteins, microbial biomass, and other organic carbon. So somebody was asking about just standard soil chem labs, you know, what are people generally testing when they get their soil test? I think generally it's production focused, so nutrients, pH, EC, electrical conductivity concerns for production.
Sure. So a couple things there, and just keep me on it if I miss any of them, because there was a few questions in there. In terms of the ACE protein and the available carbon, or the permanganate oxidizable carbon, those are commonly being included in soil health tests. The thought with the permanganate oxidizable carbon, or the active carbon, is that it's fairly sensitive to management. And so it's something that you can see changes in on a much shorter time scale than something like soil organic matter, which can take, you know, it can change more quickly maybe, but in general, 5 to 10 years, you know, of monitoring to really be able to get above the signal to noise, so to speak. And so things like POC can be something that you can see changes a little bit more quickly. You can get an idea of how your management is affecting carbon and broadly nutrient cycling based on how much of that available carbon exists in your sample. But there's, yeah, it correlates very well with soil organic matter. And so it's just kind of like another way of measuring that. It just might be able to tell us more information a little bit more quickly. The ACE protein is interesting because it's getting at all the organic proteins in the sample. And so it gives you a picture that extends beyond just mineral nitrogen, as we know that other nitrogen can also be made available for plants during the season. But I think the challenge with it, and maybe this is what you were getting at, Karen, is that we don't it's not super interpretable at this moment, especially out here in California. And so there's still a lot to learn there. I think that it is important to be looking at how we can extend beyond typical chemical tests for nitrogen, typical nitrate and ammonium analyses, because especially in organic systems, it's not really sufficient to tell them what's being made available for their plant year to year. But in terms of like interpreting that data, we're still figuring things out. Something that a lot of folks have found valuable is end mineralization. And that is basically, and I forget how many days, but it's an incubation in lab. I think it's a 7-day incubation in the lab, where it actually is just, you know, simulating what you would see in your soil, what is mineralizing or becoming available. And that can be done with an intact core, where you actually just extract the core and you don't disrupt it at all. And so that can be an even more realistic depiction of what's happening in your soil, because of course, when we disrupt the structure and we break it apart into its, you know, individual parts, it's not exactly the same system that we're seeing at the field scale and that we're interacting with in our management. And so, you know, that can be an additional way of looking at nitrogen that can provide a little more information. And I think there's a lot of folks who are interested in doing work and how to better assess, especially in things like organic systems. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot happening in that space. It's just how interpretable it is at this stage. It's a push and a pull. You know, we need more data to be able to understand it, and also someone has to bear the burden of that early stage data.
Yeah, and I know that Daniel Geisler at UC Davis is doing a lot of work looking at nitrogen mineralization rates in situ in field settings and trying to understand how well those lab studies correlate. There was some work, some of you might remember the so-called Haney test, which was another kind of effort to try to characterize nitrogen tied to the carbon cycle, sort of, kind of, and they didn't correlate super well in our conditions. So it's tricky, and you want to be thoughtful. And for those people managing production systems, it's always important to make sure that you're not assuming you've got it all dialed in, and you continue to monitor with your tried and true methods. That would just be my practical comment. So there are.
What was the question on biochar? Because I know I totally missed that.
Oh, well, they were specific measures that were of interest. So one was distinguishing between recalcitrant glycoproteins, the feasibility of distinguishing between recalcitrant glycoproteins, microbiomass, and other organic carbons.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, it's feasible, we can do it, but it's also like expensive and not commonly offered at your basic commercial lab. And yeah, it's just a very time and cost intensive process. And so, yeah, there are metrics for doing that. And I would say if you're interested in those sorts of things, probably the most likely possibility is linking up with an academic researcher or someone who has access to the equipment and the protocols to do those sorts of fractionations.
And there is a biochar group working out of UC System, and they have a web presence that is pretty, that will help you find people if that's of interest. There is sort of, I categorize them under other because we're coming to the close of our time. I'll read them off and you tackle the one that you think you can. So there were 3 of them. One was, can you comment about the utility of land surface model, also called hydrological models for estimating soil moisture? So kind of thinking again outside the box of actually you know, sampling extensively, and thoughts on remote sensing and how it could help interpret fieldwork like soil sampling. And then the last question was a timing and thinking about, which you touched on in your comments earlier, your initial comments, the importance of thinking about when you pull your sample, depending on what you're trying to characterize?
Yeah, and so, I mean, typically in terms of the timing, usually either in the fall before the season or in the spring before the season are ideal, like September, October timeframe or March, April timeframe, or sorry, April, May timeframe. But again, it's most important that it's consistent, and also there can be value to knowing what's going on at the end of the season as well. But again, that's working within your budget constraints and what's possible. But yeah, I would say, I think the question asked if spring is best for soil biology, and I could see an argument for that. But I think you could do either time, and actually both times would be better if you can do fall and spring. The more time points, there was actually some research out of Davis looking at how the microbial communities changed across the season, and they do, you know, it's and it's definitely perceivable. And so the more time points, the better with soil biology. That's the challenge. But also the beauty of soil biology is how dynamic they are. And then in terms of the land surface model around soil moisture, I have to say, I'm just gonna call myself out that hydrology is not my key area. And if there's anyone else on the call who can speak to that, that would be great. But in terms of things like remote sensing, there's actually a great paper by Pete Smith, I think that came out in 2019 or 2020, that talks about, you know, everyone's trying to grapple with these carbon markets and ecosystem markets, and how are we going to verify? And we don't even necessarily have enough on the ground data. And now it's talking about how do we calibrate all these other tools. As I mentioned at the beginning of the call, and I'm working on a paper right now on spatial variability, and we're just finding it's so much more variable than we even imagined. And so it's complicated, because if it's so variable, well, how can we measure it, you know? And if we can't measure it, how can we manage it, you know? And but the paper I mentioned from Pete Smith really focuses on using multiple approaches to kind of triangulate. So, you know, we need the on the ground sampling still, but how do we integrate things like remote sensing and modeling to help kind of fill out the picture, and to be able to make things, you know, so that we're building our tools for the future. We're basically being able to better calibrate things like remote sensing and modeling tools with the on the ground sampling. And so I think there's a place for it. The challenge for me with remote sensing is that, you know, it can only penetrate so deep, you know, maybe the surface centimeter. And so, you know, again, referencing back to the research at Russell Ranch and us recognizing more and more the importance of depth, if we're only looking at that surface centimeter, it's hard to really say a lot about the soils beneath it. We can make some assumptions, and there's pedotransfer functions that you can use, but it's not, we don't know enough yet, I think, really. Where remote sensing could be useful is like verifying practices, or some folks are using it to show whether there's been cover cropping or if there's hedgerows or things like that along the landscape. And so I think there's a place for remote sensing in these markets, but I think that especially for a grower trying to understand what's going on in their field, I think that there's a lot of challenges with it. And, you know, there's just interference even, you know, of the clouds and things like that they have to remove. And it's very early stage technology. And so I think it's great to start working on it and start calibrating it against our on the ground sampling, but it's just not there yet. And I do want to differentiate, because there's remote sensing with satellites, and then there's proximal sensing. And so that might have more promise more quickly. But yeah, I think it's just still very emerging. And then Tony put something in there about soil moisture landscape tool, which maybe was answering that the moisture question that I was not able to answer.
So I think we're coming to right at the end of our time, and there was one more question that I thought I'd close with it was somebody was just looking for, they need to put together some sort of soil sampling design protocol in some research. And so what I wanted to offer that one is maybe we could put our heads together and just pull together some resources to send out to the attendees, because there are a lot of good ones. You've alluded to some, there are some other ones. And I would just, as a comment, make sure that you've identified the lab you're going to work with and that you know what their protocols are for collecting those samples. Because if you manage your sample other than how the test assumes you've managed your sample, then calibration of those results may not be appropriate. So it's important to know who's going to process your sample for you. And Jessica, if you want to add to that, feel free.
No, I think that's really important. I think also just really, and I didn't get deep into like the thought process on this, but really just laying out, kind of beginning with the end in mind. What are your goals? You know, what do you want to know? What are you trying to measure? And then from there, figuring out the metrics that are going to help you determine that. And then from there, figuring out what are the methods that make the most sense in your region. Most of these labs will be mindful of that. For instance, like with phosphorus, labs in California are going to know to use Olsen P rather than Melick or Bray. And so I think it's just, you know, figuring out what you're interested in. There's tons of different things you could measure, but just trying to make sure, because budget is an issue for most, making sure that you're picking the things that are answering your questions the best.
Yeah. So Sarah, I think maybe we need to hand it back to you to close us out at this point. And Jessica, I thank you and your dog, who was very quiet and patient.
It's being very good.
I agree. Thank you so much, Jessica. Thank you so much, Karen, for facilitating a great conversation. Thank you to the audience members who submitted some great questions. We really enjoy this format where we get to interact with you in real time, take your questions, and really like get at the needs of the audience members here today. So with this, I'd like to go ahead and share my screen that has that QR code for the Certified Crop Advisors. And just say thank you to everybody. Again, I dropped a link in that chat of a little while ago where you're going to find the recordings to all of our California Farm Demonstration Network meetings in this series.